Chapter 11. The Verdict. Next morning, he showed up on time for court. He couldn't remember much about the night before, except that he had awakened while walking in his sleep in the desert near dawn. He'd hurried back to town and made his way to the washroom outside the courtroom, where he washed his face and combed his hair. When Senator Stewart saw him, he said,
"You look terrible. You haven't shaved. You look like you slept in your clothes. Maybe it's just as well. Better to look pathetic than too well groomed. You're just in time. I was afraid you weren't going to show. Here's the judge now."
Nathaniel, like everyone else, waited till the judge was seated before taking his place. He noticed Mullins giving him an odd look from across the aisle. Nathaniel wondered what he was thinking. Perhaps he assumed from Nathaniel's appearance that he'd been out drinking on his last night of freedom. After the preliminary rituals were over with, Judge O'Neill asked Stewart if he was ready to proceed with his defense.
"Yes, Your Honor."
Stewart arose, shuffling some papers, and went to center stage, half facing the judge and half the audience. Nathaniel glanced around. The room was packed this morning. Several people stood at the back of the room. He couldn't spot Sally or Annabelle.
"Your Honor," Stewart began, "we have heard Mrs. Preen testify that the homicide victim, known in this community as Jedediah Kramer, was none other than Mrs. Preen's husband, known in the past as Mr. Milton Preen. Lest there be any question of Mrs. Preen's testimony, I have obtained certain documents from the state of Maryland."
He held up a sheaf of papers.
"They arrived by special messenger yesterday. I wish to enter these in evidence at this time. I have a copy here of the Preen marriage certificate issued by the First Baptist Church of Baltimore and sealed by the state of Maryland."
Stewart waved the document dramatically.
"I have also certain letters from previous business associates of Mr. Preen in Baltimore, as well as from his attorney there. We also have papers written and signed by Mr. Kramer during his service at the Board of Trade, as well as mining claims filed by himself. Examination of these documents by experts will reveal that the handwriting in the signatures is identical in all cases."
The DA jumped to his feet.
"Your Honor, I have no objection to entering these documents as evidence, but I question their relevance. We are willing to stipulate that this Preen and Kramer were one and the same person and Mrs. Preen's husband. But so what? What difference does it make?"
Stewart started to respond, but the judge waved him aside.
"Overruled. We'll find out soon enough if any of this is relevant. Go ahead, Senator."
Stewart nodded and took a deep breath, composing himself. He opened the folder he was holding and withdrew another sheaf of papers.
I next wish to enter these other documents as evidence. The first is an official summary of the proceedings of the Maryland State Court in Baltimore, the people of Maryland versus Nathaniel Strange, Esquire. These documents will show that our client, Nathaniel Strange, has already been tried and convicted of the homicide of Mr. Milton Preen, alias Jedediah Kramer. Mr. Strange was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to state prison for a period of 10 years.
Stewart took out still another set of documents. Nathaniel glanced at Mullins. He looked baffled.
"Finally, Your Honor, this and citizens of the great city of Rhyolite, Nevada, I present this record of Mr. Strange's term in prison. It will show that my client served 4 years at hard labor and was then given time off for good behavior, at which time he was released, having served his debt to society."
Stewart turned to scan the faces of the audience and repeated himself.
Having served his debt to society.
He turned back to the judge just as Mullins began to rise to his feet. Senator Stewart continued.
Your Honor, I submit we are faced here with a basic and inviolable principle in common law. It is, in fact, engraved in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. I refer to the principle of non bis in idem, also known as autrefois convict. It is commonly called the principle of double jeopardy. A man may not be tried for the same crime twice, especially if he has already been convicted and paid his debt.
There was a moment of stunned silence. Mullins' eyes went wide and he stumbled backward, falling into his chair. Someone in the audience began to clap. Then others joined in, amid whistles and cheers, creating a sudden cacophony. Nathaniel glimpsed two reporters, including Hernandez, heading for the door. The judge's gavel banged and slammed like a trip hammer. Finally, when some semblance of order was restored, Mullins nearly screamed, "Your Honor, I object!"
On what grounds, Counselor?
Mullins stuttered and stammered, his face an odd shape of purple.
Your Honor, we need time to consider this. This is highly irregular. We need to research. Overruled. You'll have your chance to appeal and request a new trial if you wish. In the meantime, Stewart is right. You can't try a man twice, not even if he was found guilty the first time, especially not. I'm dismissing charges against the defendant. He's free to go. Court's adjourned.
And he slammed his gavel one last time. As he left the bench, Nathaniel noticed he was shaking his head and chuckling to himself. Later, he found he had no clear memory of the next few minutes. He could not quite take in what had just happened. Senator Stewart pumped his hand briefly, gathered up his papers, and disappeared. A mob of people surrounded Nathaniel. For a moment, he feared it might be a lynch mob, but they were all pounding his back and shaking his hand. Then he was afraid they might lift him to their shoulders. Finally, Edmund J. Fish came to his rescue.
Come on.
He grabbed Nathaniel's arm and bullied his way through the crowd, running interference like a linebacker. They made their way outside. When next Nathaniel was aware of his surroundings, he saw they had somehow evaded the mob and were seated in a booth in a small lunchroom off the main street.
Whiskey?
Fish asked.
No thanks. I think I could use some breakfast, though, and coffee. And I don't have any money with me.
Fish gave a short laugh.
Your meal's on me. This morning's entertainment was worth a fortune. Did you see Mullins' face? It looked like apoplexy.
Nathaniel started to thank Fish, but the other interrupted him.
How's it feel to be a free man?
Nathaniel stared at him.
Then it's over? You mean that's really all there is? There won't be any more investigations or trials? I can leave town if I want?
Fish shrugged.
That verdict might not stand up in a higher court. I wouldn't know, but it's not likely they'll appeal. That's expensive and takes a lot of work. And likely they'd look foolish when they lose. I think the DA will want to forget this whole thing. Stewart just made history, though. Maybe he wants to run for office again. But I hope you're not thinking of leaving town, Nathaniel. This could become the greatest city in the state of Nevada. We'd all miss you.
Nathaniel looked at the platter of eggs, bacon, and pancakes that appeared in front of him. He was ravenously hungry.
I'm not sure what I'll do now. It's not as if I've been making any plans. Right now, I just want to go home. Then I'll have time to think about it. Yes, think about it. As for myself, I believe I shall sample the whiskey here.
When he got back to his storefront, Nathaniel shook hands again with Fish, who turned and walked off. Nathaniel tried the latch, but it was locked. The blinds were drawn in the windows. Suddenly, he felt terrified. He didn't have his key, so he knocked. After a moment, Sally opened the door. He stepped in.
Annabelle,
She ain't here, Sally said. She didn't think it'd be proper for her to stay here when you returned, so she moved back to the hotel. Then she did something unexpected. She threw her arms around his neck and gave him a tight, long hug that seemed to go on for minutes. Finally, she withdrew, looked up at his face, and said, I'm glad you're back, Nathaniel.
so am I.
He looked vacantly around the room, from which it seemed he had been absent for years.
So am I.
Annabelle said to tell you she wants to see you, only not today. She's real tired. She didn't sleep for a couple days at least. She's real happy to let you go, but she says you should wait till tomorrow before you go to her. He nodded.
Yeah, that's probably best. I'm tired myself, Sally. Real tired. And I know I look bad. I need a bath and a shave.
I'll heat some water, she said. That evening, he sent Sally with a brief note asking when he and Annabelle might meet. Sally returned with a message requesting his presence in the hotel's tea room the next day at 3 p.m. The next afternoon, he shaved again and put on his best suit in preparation for keeping his appointment with Annabelle. Actually, it was his only suit, the same one Stuart had provided. Sally had given it a good brushing to make it presentable. He looked in the mirror and wished he could change his face, make it less lean and drawn and perhaps happier. But it was his face. He smiled at Sally and went out the door. Nathaniel hadn't anticipated the sudden attack of nerves he felt, nor could he yet understand the reason, though later, looking back, he would believe he understood. The tea room was located at the rear of the hotel, behind the lobby. When he entered the room, there were only 3 customers, a pair of old ladies at one table, and Annabelle at the opposite side of the room. For a moment, she looked at him, then dropped her gaze. He thought she seemed drawn and tired. Nathaniel wasn't the sort of man to think about his own feelings, but he discovered of a sudden that the palms of his hands had broken out in sweat. He coughed and made his way to her table. She rose and extended a hand, which he held briefly after wiping his own on his pants. He tried to think of what to say. She said, Please sit, Nathaniel. So he sat, worried. Anything he might say would sound silly or banal. Why had he agreed to see her? What possible good could come of this? He stared at her face, still beautiful, but looking as drawn as his own had in the mirror. She poured him a cup of tea and pushed across a little plate of biscuits. She said, I want to say thank you, Nathaniel, but I don't quite know how. Now he was puzzled.
You want to thank me? For what? I should be thanking you for what you did at the trial, for protecting Sally. I mean, she might have got off with self-defense or some such, but a trial would have been hard on her, and the jury might not have believed her. She's too young for prison. It would have killed her.
For a moment, Annabelle stared at him without speaking, as if he had addressed her in a foreign tongue. It was a moment of mutual incomprehension. Then she said, in a whisper, You think I was protecting Sally? Before he could respond, she leaned more closely across the tiny table, her pale hands curled around her teacup as if trying to choke it. She said, Senator Stewart swore me to silence until the trial. Of course,
If it had turned out differently, I would have come forward at once. That night, when we went to see Milton, she broke off, cleared her throat, and began again. I wanted to go there alone. I didn't want Sally to come with me. I especially didn't want you along. I hoped I could reason with him, but Sally insisted on coming. I couldn't shake her off. On our way to the mine, I told her I was afraid he might become angry and violent. I thought that would scare her into turning back, but it didn't work. Instead, she held out her handbag, the one she always carries. She opened it and showed me the gun.
Nathaniel had been about to sip from his cup of tea. Suddenly his hand shook and he put the cup down, spilling half of it.
I was horrified.
Annabelle said,
I'd no idea she possessed such an awful weapon. Without even thinking, I snatched it from her and slipped it into my pocket. I considered throwing it away, but I knew she'd only go after it. She asked me what I was going to do with her gun, so I told her I'd return it to her later. Perhaps you can guess what happened. Milton became more angry than I'd expected. I kept thinking it was my fault for confronting him like that. I know now that was nonsense. Anger was his own choice. He chose also to attack me. He put his hands around my neck and tried to strangle me. I couldn't breathe. Sally got up and started pounding on his back, but he ignored her. Then I wasn't even thinking about it, but I took out the gun, pointed it, and pulled the trigger. It made such a loud noise. Milton looked surprised and let go of me. He sat down on the floor. I guess I dropped the gun right after it went off. That's when you came in.
He stared at her a moment longer.
I never dreamed it was you.
He reached across and took both her hands.
But it wasn't your fault. You were only defending yourself.
No.
She pulled her hands back and sat up straight.
No. I wanted to kill him. I have wanted to kill him for many years.
Chapter 12. 2 years later. He came back to Rhyolite in July of 1910, arriving on the noon train from Las Vegas. At least the train still stopped there. He spent 3 or 4 hours walking the streets, remembering the short time he'd lived there and saddened by the changes he saw. Missing was the distant clatter of the stamping mill, now fallen silent. Missing also were people in the streets. Nathaniel had heard that only 600 or 700 people still lived here. From what he saw, there might have been none. Cook's Bank was closed. The nearby school, almost brand new, sat empty. Many of the other buildings were being dismantled, lumber salvaged from the frames. The churches were boarded up, the stores closed. Sadly, he looked through the window of the ice cream parlor, listening for the shrieks of vanished children. He went to his old storefront and found the place partly demolished, the windows removed, the plumbing fixtures gone, even the front door missing, and his old dentist chair nowhere to be seen. However, he was surprised to find his old wagon still parked where he had left it, in the back alley. He trudged on. The 66 Club, at least, was still in operation. No doubt it depended on business from passengers on the trains when the locomotives stopped to take on water and load freight. It seemed the only place of business still hanging on. Even Madame Lamar's house was boarded up. Nathaniel sat at the bar in the club and asked for a cold beer. He was startled by a familiar voice from the corner. Edmund J. Fish.
Did you finally decide to purchase some property?
Fish asked, sitting down next to him. Nathaniel smiled.
Not yet, Mr. Fish. I'm surprised to see you here. Still peddling real estate for the suckers, are you? In a manner of speaking, I've been selling off buildings for salvage. Did you know they're selling the vaults from out of the bank as well as the marble floors? But I don't expect I'll be here much longer. Business is better elsewhere. He gave a short laugh. Shorty Harris came through here last week. I bought him a drink. He sold out his interest in the mining claim 5 years ago, only $900. I offered to sell him the rest of the town for $200. He turned me down. Fish laughed again. A foxy old bastard. Nathaniel smiled again, sipped his beer, and said nothing. What are you doing back in town anyway? Fish asked. Did you forget something? No. Nathaniel stared at his own face in the mirror behind the bar. It's not that I forgot something. It's more that I wanted to remember. I needed to come back one last time before the town vanishes, before Snallygaster takes her. Before what? Never mind. Just an old story I heard. The miners still think Kramer made the vein pinch out in the mine. Who knows? I haven't seen you since the day of the trial. Where did you go anyway? Nathaniel wondered for a moment if it might not have been he himself who had caused the mine to fail by going underground with the Snallygaster on his back. But he said nothing about that. He glanced at the man next to him. He looked a bit seedy down at the heels. Nathaniel decided to pay for the drinks. San Diego. I could see no reason for me to stay here. I got what I came for. The Navy had recently opened a coaling station in San Diego. There were a lot of sailors in town and a shortage of tattoo artists. I made a good living there. I also started doing some formal portrait paintings. You would be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't be, to know how many young naval officers want their portraits done. Before I knew what was happening, I had a reputation and a couple of shows. So I'm out of the epidermal illumination business. I'm a painter now, an artist. Aha! Well, my congratulations, sir. I'm sure you'll do well. But what about that girl of yours? What was her name? Salome, I believe. And what of your Mrs. Breen? Nathaniel had not intended to tell the man so much. Looking in the mirror, he said, Before I left, I asked Mrs. Breen to marry me. She turned me down. She said it would take time to sort out her feelings, as she put it. She couldn't understand why I still loved her after the way she treated me and after what she had done. But never mind that. I knew it would be useless to insist. We did agree, however, that it would be better for her to look after Sally. They both decided they'll go to San Francisco. He turned to smile at Fish. This time, he felt some joy in it. There was money that I thought was owed to Annabelle, but she wouldn't take it. Instead, she said she would manage it for Sally. Sally wanted to go to art school at the university, so that's what she's been doing. Look here. From inside his jacket, Nathaniel pulled out a worn copy of a fashionable ladies' magazine published in the East. He pointed to the cover. You see that? That's one of Sally's illustrations. She's already making a name for herself. Now she wants to go off to study in Paris for a year. So, you've been keeping in touch? Fish said. Now Nathaniel felt a sudden odd reluctance to say more. He had a vague, superstitious feeling that telling of his good fortune might once again tempt Snallygaster. Oh, yeah. We exchange correspondence every week or so. He glanced at the clock on the wall. But I'm afraid you have to excuse me, Mr. Fish. I'm meeting someone on the next train, and then I'll be on my way out of town again. Best of luck to you. He dropped a $20 gold piece on the counter. For your next drink, or in case you want to buy Shorty Harris another. He dismounted from the stool and turned to go.
Fish caught at his sleeve.
One question before you go, sir. If you please.
He glanced around to make sure the bartender wasn't listening.
I've been wanting to ask this for 2 years. Did you really shoot Kramer? If not, who? Who killed that awful man?
Nathaniel gave himself one last glance in the mirror. It occurred to him that he had never looked exactly like this before this day, nor would he ever again. In a sudden insight, he saw the true nature of Snallygaster. The four-legged serpent was time itself. He turned back to Fish.
All 3 of us killed him,
he said. The train was on time. Once again, he felt that ancient terror, that fear rise within him. He waited impatiently while people got on and off the 2 passenger cars. She was the last off.
You haven't changed,
she said.
That's a lie. Though I see you have only improved.
Another lie. He stood awkwardly, feeling rigid as a board.
How was Sally?
She promised to stay out of trouble until I get back. I don't believe her.
I should hope not.
She gave him a long look.
Are you just going to stand there, staring?
No, I mean...
She slid her arms about his neck, effectively silencing him. Suddenly, he found himself embracing her to the point of pain.
Annabelle.
Hush.
We're really getting married then?
What do you think?
Oddly, he felt surprised when she giggled. She sounded happy.
But not here in Rhyolite, he said. We can't. The churches are closed, and the justice of the peace is permanently out of town. We'll have to stop in Goldfield.
Well then, let's get back on the train, unless you have a better idea.
No, I mean, yes. Let's get back on the train.
He kissed her right out in public where anyone could see. The engine's whistle blew. The conductor rang his bell and shouted, "All aboard!" Nathaniel turned for one last look at the city of Rhyolite. He quelled sudden, raw emotion and whispered,
Farewell.
Not the end. Postscript. Many readers may not believe this, but it's true. When I began this story, I had no idea it was inspired by The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In fact, I had never actually read the book. I was familiar with the story, having been exposed to a number of American literature classes in the dim past. I may even have watched a black and white movie version at some point now long forgotten. When I was several thousand words into this tale, it occurred to me to wonder where I had come up with the name Preen. It seemed vaguely familiar. Then it came to me. Of course, Hester Prynne. Later, someone pointed out that my protagonist had the same first name as the author of Scarlet Letter. Until that moment, my mind had somehow succeeded in suppressing that information from my consciousness. I have since read the original book, which I think is deeply embedded in the collective awareness of Americans. It is a story of responsibility and guilt. The critical reader will find a number of plot elements common to both Hawthorne's story and my own. They are not the same stories, but the themes are identical. As for the great city of Rhyolite, only ruins remain. It joins the older ruins of the Anasazi elsewhere in the Southwest. Perhaps some future archaeologist will get the two cultures confused. To me, Rhyolite represents a microcosm of civilization. Its citizens believed it would flourish, prosper, and last for centuries, yet it was snatched away by the Snallygaster, time itself, before anyone had a chance to notice. Cities rise and fall, some more quickly than others. I wonder often how long our own cities may endure. Let us enjoy them while we can. The end.